We're going to continue on in Matthew chapter 5, and hopefully, I don't anticipate, honestly, that we'll finish this whole lesson tonight, but we are approaching the end of chapter 5. We are going to be looking at the last few verses of chapter 5 in our study in the Sermon on the Mount, which means tonight we will be approximately 1/3 of the way through as far as chapters go. I don't know how far we are in terms of content. We're probably more than 1/3 of the way through because we really crawled through the Beatitudes. But we are about to be finishing up the first of the 3 chapters that are known as the Sermon on the Mount. And just to kind of set the stage and to recap, I have mentioned for several weeks now that the key to understanding much of the Sermon on the Mount is found in verse 20 of chapter 5. Verse 20 of chapter 5 says this, "I say unto you," Jesus says, "that unless your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven." Now, why was that such a shocking and scandalous thing for Jesus to say?
The Pharisees thought they were the most righteous.
The Pharisees thought they were the most righteous, and so did everybody else, right? The Pharisees were like the holy people. And for Jesus to say, you've got to be more holy than them, that kind of gave people the impression of, oh, well, they're toast, right? If the Pharisees can't make it, then how could I, a normal commoner, possibly make it? And it also had that secondary effect of grating on the Pharisees' nerves, which Jesus loved to do, by telling them and confronting them with the fact that you are not as righteous as you think, right? This is what he's saying to the Pharisees. And from there, we have gone on and we have heard a series of statements where Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, but I say unto you." And we've gone through a number of these. And in fact, he started with the issue of murder. You have heard that it was said, you should not commit murder. Jesus said, "But I say unto you, whoever is angry at their brother in their heart, whoever harbors that anger in their heart is in danger of the sin of murder, is in danger of the judgment that is the result of that in the first place." He said, the righteousness that exceeds the Pharisees is not only not to murder, but it's to not even hold grudges. It's to not even hold on to anger in your heart against your brother. He said, "You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery." And Jesus said, "But I say unto you, anyone who looks on a woman to lust after her in her heart is already guilty of the sin of adultery." So the standard, once again, was if you don't commit adultery, you're righteous. Jesus says, no, it's deeper than that. If you harbor lust in your heart, you're guilty of adultery. The righteousness that exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees goes beyond the external. It goes beyond the actions that we do on the outside, and it gets into the condition and the attitude of our heart. True righteousness, Jesus said, is what is on the inside even more than what is on the outside. He goes on from there and he says, "You have heard that it was said, if you divorce your wife, you should give her a certificate of divorce." Jesus says, "But I say unto you that anyone who divorces except for the cause of fornication is guilty of adultery, and anyone who marries the one who is divorced except for that case is also guilty of adultery." He says the righteousness that exceeds the Pharisees is the Pharisees say you need to do the proper paperwork. Jesus says these marriages are intended to be permanent. These marriages are intended to be... The true righteousness is not to divorce at all. He goes on and he says, "You have heard that it was said that you shall perform all of the oaths that you swear to the Lord." If you swear to the Lord that you're going to do an oath, if you invoke the name of the Lord in an oath, that you shall perform that thing. Jesus says, "But I say unto you, it is better not to swear at all." Do not even create the occasion for sin. We should live lives that are of simplicity. We should have words that are trustworthy. We should be able just to say yes or no, and that be sufficient. Live such a life where you don't even need to swear vows in the first place. And then what we looked at last week was the issue of revenge. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to them the left cheek also. If someone sues you to take your coat, give them your cloak also. If somebody compels you to walk 1 mile, walk with them 2. And the basic idea there is do not take vengeance into your own hands. The righteousness of the Pharisees said, if somebody hits you, you hit them back. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But Jesus said the righteousness that transcends that, the righteousness that is greater than that, is to be willing to suffer wrong to yourself, to commit all vengeance, to commit all retribution to God and not to handle that yourself on a personal level, to allow yourself to be exploited and abused in a sense in order to not have to exercise vengeance yourself. And so I know there was only a few people there when we talked about that last week. You can go back to the YouTube page and listen to that when it's uploaded, which it's not right now, but it will be soon. You can go back and listen to that if you missed that lesson. What we're going to talk about tonight is really, in a sense, a continuation of that, but it is also the last "you have heard, but I say unto you." So far he's gone through 5 of these different issues. We've looked at the law of Moses, what the law of Moses had to say. And each one of these we've examined the tradition of the scribes and the Pharisees. And then we've seen Jesus saying, but this is what it really means. Jesus saying he's not setting aside the law. He's not saying there's a problem with the law. He's saying the problem is with the tradition. The problem is with how this command has been interpreted, how it is being applied. And Jesus is coming here not to set aside the law of Moses, but to set the record straight, as it were. He's coming along to say this is the intention of the command. This is the spirit of the law. This is what God really intended when he spoke this thing, not what the traditions of the elders had developed over time. Are there any questions or comments or anything about all the material that we've studied leading up to this point? We're all on the same page? Well, let's continue moving on. Once again, we're going to see the same pattern. You have heard that it was said, but I say unto you, and then we're going to look at how to make some application. Tonight we're going to read from Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 through 48. So if somebody wants to read that entire passage, verses 43 through 48.
You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
All right, so here is our passage. And if you have, depending on what version of the Bible you're reading, you probably noticed in this passage there are a couple textual variants. There's a couple significant textual variants, and we will talk about those things as they come up. As we approach them, we will discuss them a little bit, but this is our text. This is what we're working with tonight. And again, we see the same pattern laid out. You have heard that it was said, but I say unto you. So let's go ahead and just simply get into it, beginning with verse 43. What does Jesus say? You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And as always, as with each of these that we've looked at, Jesus is drawing from an Old Testament passage. Does anybody have a Bible that may have a cross-reference for this? Is there anyone who has a cross-reference? And what does your cross-reference tell you? Where does it tell you to look when you look at verse 43?
Matthew 22, 37 through 40.
Okay, that's not the one that I had in mind. Let's skip that. Is it? Okay, Leviticus chapter 19. Well, let's go check that out. Let's use the tools that are provided in our Bibles. Let's go look at Matthew chapter 19. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. Because what we're going to see here is that this is probably what Jesus had in mind when he says this. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. So let's look at this. We're going to be looking at the book of Leviticus, chapter 19. We're going to look at verse 18. And as people are getting there, I'll just point out, Leviticus chapter 19 is smack dead in the middle of what we call the Holiness Code. And the Holiness Code is basically all the way from Leviticus, basically like chapter 17 to 20 or so. But in that, we've looked at Leviticus 19 before because we've looked at Leviticus 18 and 20 before. Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 are two passages that reference homosexuality. So as we've talked about Pride Month over the years, we have looked at these passages in Leviticus to see what they have to say about the sin of homosexuality before. And one of the arguments that people often make when you talk about these kinds of things is that, well, if you're going to have that perspective, then shouldn't you not eat shellfish, and shouldn't you not clip the edge of your beard, and shouldn't you not do... Because all of those things are found in the book of Leviticus as well. And that's a valid point, but there are other things found in the book of Leviticus, such as what we find smack dead in the middle of the holiness code, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. Will somebody please read that verse?
You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudges against the children of your people. You shall love your neighbors as yourself. I am the Lord.
Okay, very good. And we see how this ties directly into what we talked about last week, where Jesus said we are not to take vengeance into our own hands. We are not to avenge ourselves, but we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so this is kind of the root of this command that Jesus is talking about. You have heard it said, he says, that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, it's interesting to me that in Jesus' summary of the tradition of the elders, it's not included here, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It simply says, you shall love your neighbor. You know, we all love ourselves in a tremendous way. And we don't have a problem loving other people from afar. But when it comes to you got to love each other like you love yourself, well, that's a little bit different, because I love myself a lot. And no offense, but you guys are a lot harder to love than me because, you know, I'm me, right? I love myself dearly. It's much more difficult to love other people, especially in the way that we love ourselves. And we demonstrate our love for ourselves every day by the fact that we get up, we feed our bodies, we bathe, we take care of ourselves, we get the proper amount of rest, we take medicine when we're sick. We know that we love ourselves because we take care of ourselves. And what this command is telling us, we must love our neighbor even as ourselves. But we understand that part of the tradition has said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And obviously nowhere in here it talks about hating your enemy, right? So where does that come from? Where does this idea of you shall hate your neighbor come from? It's not surprising that the people would think that. You know, I think back over some of the passages that we find, specifically in the law, things like, when you enter into the land of Canaan, when you enter in and conquer this city, you are to kill every man, every woman, every child, every beast. You shall not leave any of them alive. You will completely devote the entire city and all of its inhabitants to the sword and to destruction. And that's said of many of the Gentile peoples while the people were entering Canaan. He says, you shall wipe their memory from the face of the earth, right? God is telling the Israelites in the time of Moses and in the time of Joshua to completely destroy and to wipe out these pagan communities which are being conquered. You can read in the book of Psalms where the author is praying and he's saying, Lord, break the teeth of my enemies, break their jawbones. Happy is the Israelite who smashes the enemy's babies' heads against the stones. These kinds of things. These are called imprecatory psalms. Imprecatory psalms where the person who is praying for God to punish his enemies, to destroy his enemies, to, as we said, there's some very graphic language in some of these psalms where the author, King David or whoever else, is praying, God destroy these people. And so it's not surprising that a tradition would develop that says, you know, God wants us to love our neighbor, but hate our enemies. After all, look at what King David said about his enemies. Look at what Joshua said about the Canaanites, those filthy dogs and idolaters. Look at how we were supposed to treat these people in the past. Yes, we should love our neighbor, but we should hate our enemies. God says it, you know. This is the tradition that had kind of built up. Any thoughts, questions, or comments about any of that stuff so far? Have y'all ever been like reading through the Psalms and read one of these Psalms and been like, oh, you know? I pray through a prayer book, and so I pray the Psalms very regularly. And often I come upon these imprecatory Psalms, and I've talked to some people and they say, I just feel weird even reading these things and praying these things because it just feels very unchristianly to ask God to break the teeth of my enemies, you know? And I don't have a problem praying those prayers because my thing is it's like I'm praying the Psalms. These are in the Psalms and I'm just praying it. God knows with perfect wisdom the condition of my heart and the condition of everything else. And so if I have a bad attitude while I'm praying that, he'll reveal that to me, you know what I'm saying? So I don't have a problem personally praying those prayers. It's not like I go out of my way to look for them, but they are there. They exist. Those things are there. And so it's not surprising that we should see, this tradition build up of hating your enemies.
That's one of the things that a lot of people are atheists or know about the Bible. They'll use like the Amorites, where he tells them to slaughter everything, even the cattle. And you get to the little children, it's really hard to explain, why, because there's never really given a really good explanation why he's telling them to do it, just do it.
Yeah, he does tell.
He's a loving God because of that.
Yeah, and I've had this very conversation with people. In fact, I had a guy get red in the face and screaming mad at me having this conversation because, the truth is when we look at these passages about the destruction of the Amorites, we have to understand that all of this was happening in a specific context. And the context is this. God brought the people of Israel into Egypt for a period of 400 years where they were incubated as a people. They developed into a mighty nation. And it says, even before that one of the reasons why God put them in Egypt for 400 years is because the cup of iniquity of the land of Canaan had not yet been full. God was giving a space of 400 years for the land of Canaan and the inhabitants thereof to fill their own cup of iniquity, to fill up, as it were, their own cup of wrath, so that God would be just in pouring his wrath out upon them. And it talks about when they go in that time and in that specific place and in that specific time, God was using the Israelites as a tool of judgment in his hand to judge the peoples of the land of Canaan. This was a unique thing. This is not something that has happened since. This is not something that could happen today. This was a unique time, a unique dispensation, if you will, where God was judging the inhabitants of the land of Canaan with Israel being the club in his hand. And God did the same thing to Israel. In Isaiah 10, we can read about this. He speaks of the Assyrians as a club in his hand, as an axe in his use, as a tool that God is using to bring judgment against the Israeli people. And he says, because of the wickedness of their heart, because of the evil intentions of their heart, while they are doing this, God turns around and judges the Assyrians. Even though he himself is using them as a tool to judge his people, because they're doing it with evil intent in their heart, he turns around and judges them, not for the external act of what they were doing, but for the condition of their heart while they were doing it. That's an aside. I say that to say the reason why we see Israel wiping out these people in the land of Canaan is because that was a unique period in history where God was using the Jewish people as a weapon in his hand to execute judgment on the land of Canaan. Something that he has every right and every prerogative to do, for he is the creator and sustainer of all things, including the nations of Canaan.
How do you answer small children and animals?
At the church.
What would you tell somebody that was using that as their leverage? Because on its face, it sounds like it's, they should be innocent. How can you judge a child who
and this is what makes people very angry when you tell them this. There's no such thing as an innocent person. There's no such thing as an innocent person. The idea of innocent humanity does not exist. Everybody is guilty and condemned in Adam. All of us are guilty. All of us are inheritors of death. There is no such thing as an innocent person. And we all have to come back to, it was God's purpose and his intention in that time to judge those people. And who am I to question what the potter does with his clay? Who am I to scrutinize God and his executing his justice and his vengeance on the earth? Me, who don't know anything about anything, even in my own life. How am I supposed to put God in the dock and judge him based on his eternal purposes and his perfect justice? And that's not an emotionally satisfying answer, but it's a true answer. And that kind of answer has a tendency to make people very angry. But that's my answer.
I hate to.
No, go ahead.
Well, I've heard of some other answers.
There are other
One
answers.
of the reasons why, if you show the mercy to the children, what are you going to do once you kill the parents? The children can't survive on their own, so you'd have to take them in. And that defeats the purpose of what God's doing to begin with. Besides, when you kill them, I don't want to say it's an age of accountability or whatever. they got a direct line to heaven.
And I've heard that. That's what a lot of people say, that it's actually an act of mercy because people under the age of accountability go to heaven or whatever. That's not something that I hold to. But my answer to that is simply, God is inscrutable. And that's what he was doing. He was executing his justice and his vengeance on the earth. And I might not understand it, I might not like it, but it is the reality of the situation. And I'm not in any position to judge him in what he considers to be right. That's how I think.
Am I wrong in remembering, I may have to say, weren't they the ones that sacrificed their children?
Yeah, there was many peoples in the land did that, including the Israelites. So that was a common practice in the land of Canaan. Worship of the god of Molech. They would offer their children to the fire. And Molech was like a fertility god. So it's the idea is you offer the human sacrifice of an infant to this god and hoping that god would bless you with rainy seasons and harvest and all of that stuff. That was a common practice in the land of Canaan, including among the Israelites and the people of Judah. Part of the reason why God brought his justice against them in the latter portions of the kingdom was because they were doing that very thing. Kind of shift gears and get back to what we were talking about, though. We can see how this idea, this tradition of hating your enemy has came about. I mean, part of what the Jews were called to do is to destroy their enemies in the land of Canaan, to completely wipe them out. So you can see how that kind of attitude would develop among the people. Now, there's a key question that pops up here. If the command is to love your neighbor as yourself, the key question is obviously what? Who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? If the command is love your neighbor as yourself, well, the question is, who's my neighbor? And the tradition of the Jews said this, the Jew is my neighbor. My neighbor is my fellow Jew. We're from different tribes or whatever, but we're Jews, we're neighbors. And so I love fellow Jews, but the Gentiles and the Samaritans, no, we hate them. They're our enemies. But we love our neighbor who are the Jews. It can get even narrower. You might have Pharisees or Sadducees or religious leaders say, well, the Pharisee is my neighbor, actually. Pharisees say, the Pharisee is my neighbor. These common people out here, they're under the curse of God. They don't know anything. They're ignorant. But the Pharisees, these are my neighbors. These are my people. This is my group. This is who I'm my neighbor to. The rest of y'all, whatever, but these are my people. There was a strong tradition at the time that said this, the one who is kind and good to me, that's who my neighbor is. The one who treats me well, that's my neighbor. The one who is benevolent towards me, that's who my neighbor is. So I should love the people who are kind to me, who are benevolent toward me, because those are my neighbors. The people who despitefully use me, the people who insult me, the people who oppress me, those people are my enemies. But the people who are kind to me, who are benevolent, those are my neighbors. And of course, as I already mentioned, we know who the enemies are. The enemies are the Gentiles. The enemies are the Roman occupiers. The enemies are the Samaritans, those filthy half-breeds. The enemies are even the Jews who are more Greek than Hebrew. Those Greek and Jews who are out there adopting all this pagan philosophy, they're not really our neighbor either. They're basically Greek themselves. So they're our enemy, but us right here, us four and no more, we're a group. These are my neighbors. Everybody else, I can just hate them. I can treat them bad. I can despitefully use them because God's command says to love my neighbor. Well, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? And let's turn together to Deuteronomy chapter 22. Because, we really got to answer this question. We really got to know, who is my neighbor? That's how we can walk in obedience to this command. Who is my neighbor? To love my neighbor as myself, I got to know who my neighbor is. Let's look together at Deuteronomy chapter 22, and we're going to begin in verse 1.
You shall not see your brother's ox or his sheep going astray, and hide yourself from them. You shall certainly bring them back to your brother.
Go all the way down to verse 4, if you will.
And if your brother is not near you, or if you do not know him, then you shall bring it to your own house, and it shall remain with you until your brother sees it. Then you shall restore it to him. You shall do the same with his donkey, and so shall you do with his garment, with any lost things of your brother's, which he has lost and you have found, you shall do likewise. You must not hide yourself. You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fall down along the road, and hide yourself from them. You shall surely help him lift them up again.
Okay, so here's an example of somebody loving their neighbor. This is an example of what it looks like to love our neighbor. And in this passage, who is our neighbor?
Anybody?
Well, what does it say? What is the word that is used in verse 1?
Brother?
Your brother. So if you see your brother's ox or his sheep, if you see anything belonging to your brother, you should keep it and return it to them when they come looking for it. If your brother's donkey or his sheep or whatever falls in a pit, don't run away. Help him. Help him. We are to help our neighbor. We are to help our brother. So just reading this, we get the idea, well, maybe my neighbor is my brother. Maybe my neighbor are my relatives. My neighbor are my countrymen, fellow Jews. My neighbor are the people of my race, of my ethnicity. My neighbor are the people whom I am related to, right? They are my brother. So we can see how this is developing, and we can see how that idea of the Pharisees is reinforced when we look at a command like this. We are commanded to help our brother. We are commanded to assist our brother when our brother is in need. These are the people we should be helping. Let's look now together at Exodus chapter 23.
But
Go ahead.
There's a little phrase here that kind of trips that thought. At least
Okay.
it's in my Bible. 22:2. And if your brother is not near you, or if you do not know him,
Mm-hmm.
you know, sometimes you can say, oh, the guy down, he lives a mile away, his
Mm-hmm.
cattle out, you know, I passed by his house many times, I don't know him, and look, there's his house. And so, or if you do, so part of it is, yes, okay, your brother, but that little phrase right there is maybe not just my brother.
Yeah, maybe it's not just a relative. Maybe it's not just people you know well. Maybe this is applying kind of more broad than that. People you live around, to extend what we would consider like a neighbor, right? But again, this, in the context, we're talking about our brother. Maybe it's not a direct relation. Maybe it's just an ethnic relation. Maybe it's simply people of your tribe, people of your town, whatever. Maybe that's the idea. But let's look together now at Exodus 23. Exodus. Let's look at the book of Exodus. And we're going to look at chapter 23. And let's read verses 4 and 5 of Exodus chapter 23.
If you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you fallen down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help them with it.
That's good right there. So, well, this just shed a whole bunch of light on the idea of who is my neighbor, didn't it? Because in Deuteronomy 22 it said, if your brother's ox is lost in the way, you should return it to him. And we say, okay, yeah, these are my people. I don't have a problem with that. Fellow Jews, fellow countrymen, even my neighbor in my town, I don't have a problem with that. But here in Exodus 23, we see basically the same exact command, only who is the object in this one?
The one who hates you.
Our enemy, the one who hates us. And so putting these two together, what we actually see is that this concept of love your neighbor applies not only to your brother, not only to your countrymen, not only to those of the same race or ethnicity as you. The command to love your neighbor applies even to your enemy, even to the ones who hate you, even to the ones who oppress and persecute you. We see that this same command is given in reference to both of these groups of people. Any questions or thoughts or comments on this?
I have here my grandpa said that someone that he know has an enemy, and they got angry at each other, and they had make about that whatever, if they ever see each other again, they will kill each other. One day, one of the two of them, one was working in the hill, and the other one was working in the plant. And the one that was working in the hill, and that's true story. The one that was working in the hill, he had a heart attack. And when he fell, he started running, and he saw it. His enemy saw it, and he ran and got him, on him his arms until he come back.
Wow.
And right there, his enemy told him that he thanked him and asked him for forgiveness, told him that there will be, I was not no more angry in this, but that was his love to each other.
Yeah.
For what he did. That was his enemy, and they was to say that if they ever see each other again, they will kill each other.
Yeah. But that one act of love destroyed all the hatred, it destroyed all the animosity,
Exactly.
and it created something beautiful. That's a great picture of exactly what we're talking about tonight.
I got a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Does the Ten Commandments say thou shalt not kill?
Mm-hmm.
Does it say who you can't kill?
No, I think we've talked about this probably before. When you talk about the command, you shall not kill, a more proper translation would be you shall not murder. And then we have to talk about the distinction between killing and murder, because not all killing is murder. There are situations where killing is appropriate and justified, and there are situations where killing is not, and where it is murder. And we've talked about this before. You can have two people in the same situation doing the same thing, but it be totally different. And the difference is the condition of the heart while it's happening. Does that make sense? And so, like, one illustration I always use, you can have two soldiers who are at war, and they're fighting an enemy. And one of them is defending his life, defending his friend, defending his nation or whatever. And so he has to kill in that situation. That's not the same thing as murder. But you can have somebody who is right next to that person also killing people, but the motivation of their heart is not honorable and virtuous. The motivation of their heart is fueled by hatred and revenge and just a desire to inflict pain. And for that person, you're more likely to be judged guilty as murder, even though you're in the same situation doing the same thing. The difference is the condition of the heart behind the act. Does that make sense?
Kinda, I just don't see any reason to kill a child, no matter what. There's just no reason to kill a child. That's my problem with it.
I always battle that. If God asked me to go kill these children over here, I can't imagine there would ever be a reason for that now. But would I say, yeah, could I do that? I mean, because, I look at it as most innocent. They haven't really done anything. Even if they were born into sin, they haven't had any chance for redemption yet. If they even know what that means.
But anyhow, that's just me. I just don't see the fine line between murder and killing.
Well, this murder is kind of like that guy that said that he wanted to kill Mexicans, and he went to the Walmart and shoot a bunch of people. I would think that would be a murder.
Yeah, that would definitely be murder,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. That would definitely be murder, so...
Man, think about it, in Vietnam, they use their kids too.
And that's common amongst all kinds of areas. Like, that's common in the Middle East. That's common all over the place.
You didn't trust a child.
Yeah.
That was bad.
Yeah. And, we see a lot, you see a lot in the news, like, especially with, like, the Israel-Gaza conflict. It makes big news when either America or Israel drone strikes kids, and we think, how could that possibly happen? And it is a tragedy anytime that happens. Don't misunderstand me. But like our brother just said, if you just disconnect emotionally for a second and you think about it from a strategic point of view, from the point of view of a state, does that kid have a bomb strapped to his chest? Is that kid carrying an IED? Is that kid gonna walk up on our troop and blow up and kill all of me and all of my friends? And those kinds of things happen. And so, yeah, we live in a dark and twisted world, and all kinds of dark and twisted things happen. But I do think it's important for us to think very carefully about things and to be able to recognize the difference between murder and justified killing. Those things matter. You know, the same God who said, "You shall not murder," is the same God who said, "If you take a man's life, by man your life shall be ended." And so we can't set these things at opposition to one another. We have to figure out how to harmonize them. We have to figure out how these things fit together in an appropriate way. And that's not always easy. That requires a lot of hard work. That requires a lot of diligent thought. That requires us to turn off the TV and put away our cell phone and just sit quietly in the presence of God, meditating on His Word and meditating on just careful thinking to be able to put these things together in our mind. And that's time well spent. It's time well spent to do that, and it's good for us to be challenged. It's good for us to be confronted. It's good for us to have our own ideas and our own traditions challenged and confronted by what the Word of God says and by various other things as well. So I think it's good and important for us to really wrestle and think through these issues. That's why I really like the questions that everybody is asking tonight.
Well, kind of like, what is the timeline between, the 10 Commandments and all this killing of everybody in Canaan? What's the timeline?
I mean, all of this would have been happening around 1450 BC or so. That's the time when Moses brought the people of Israel out. So in the late 1400s or early 1300s BC is the period in history when this is happening. Is that the question you're asking? Yeah, so that was in that time, however long ago that was. What, like 3,600 years ago? 3,500 years ago or so?
So the 10 Commandments was 400 years before they got to Canaan.
No, that would have been like 40 years before they got to Canaan. Because you have Moses leading the people of Israel through the desert wilderness for 40 years, and then he dies, Joshua takes over, and they go into the land of Canaan.
When did they kill all the Canaanites?
During that time. And they didn't actually do it. That's part of Israel's problem, is they didn't actually do it. They didn't kill the Canaanites. They didn't wipe the Canaanites out. They didn't obey God and what He told them to do. And the result for them was devastating. The result for them was that they adopted the customs and the culture of the people, adopted the practices of the people, including offering their own children as sacrifices. And as a result, in the same way that God used Israel to judge Canaan, God used Assyria and God used Babylon to judge Israel in the same exact way. So because they were disobedient, it created a lot of issues down the road for future generations. And that's an important thing for us to remember. The things that we do now in time echo through eternity, if I can quote Gladiator over here. But the things that we do now have impact on future generations in a way that we could never understand. The decisions that we make now, today, can impact generations of our descendants hundreds and thousands of years down the road. Think about our entire society. Our entire society was built and developed not in the 1700s, but way, way back, way before that. It was the actions of men and women throughout history and all kinds of different places and times. All of their little individual actions throughout history cultivated in the life that we have now. And the same thing happened to them. The same thing happens all over the place. So this is great. Any other questions? Any other comments?
Well, the one thing we have now that they didn't have then is right, sacrifice, taking our system. Oh, move on. There's more than a blank page in the Old Testament. There's a cross. Without that cross, we'd all be doomed.
How come the Jewish people say they're the children of God, and yet they're eradicating another people?
Well, I'm sure there's some people who would actually view their attempts to eradicate people groups, if that's what you think is happening. I'm sure there are some people who would say this is a fulfillment of what God told them to do. I don't know if this is true, but I'm sure that it is true. I'm sure there are certain sects of those who are a member of the religion of Judaism who would view their conquest of the Middle East today as a continuation of what God commanded them to do all the way back here in His law. I'm sure that that exists. But I've said it before and I'll say it again. The secular state of Israel, we should never confuse the modern secular nation state of Israel with the Davidic kingdom or the nation of Israel as it exists in the Old Testament. Totally different thing. The nation of Israel is a secular nation. It's not a theocracy. They don't govern according to God's law. Modern day Judaism is a false religion. It hates Christ. It rejects Christ. So modern day Jews, whether you're part of the state of Israel or whether you're an observant of the religion of Judaism, those things are not friends of Christianity. Those things are not lined up with Christianity. They're opposed to Christianity. Secular government is opposed to Christianity. The religion of Judaism is opposed to Christianity. So, what they do, I can't account for what people do. Just like I can't account for what Muslim countries do. I can't account for what the secular states of Europe did in the 20th century. Wicked people do wicked things all the time. And that we shouldn't be surprised when that happens. That we should understand that that's the norm. And apart from the grace of God in all of our lives, we would be right there participating in evil deeds with everybody else. So the only thing that separates us from anybody else is the grace of God. That's important to understand as well. Let me steer back this way a little bit. So again, the key question is, who is my neighbor? And we have seen in these passages in Exodus and Deuteronomy, okay, well, we're supposed to help our brother, but we're also supposed to help our enemy. And this is not the only time we've looked at. Let's look at Luke chapter 10 together. Because Jesus had to answer this same question. Let's read Luke chapter 10 together. And we're going to begin Luke chapter 10. We're going to begin at verse 25 when we get there. Don't start reading yet. We're going to start in Luke chapter 10. We're going to begin in verse 25. Will somebody please read verses 25 through 27?
And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What is written in the law? What is your reading of it? So he answered and said, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself.
Okay, so we have a situation, and there's other stories like this in the New Testament as well, but we have a guy who comes up to Jesus and says, Jesus, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? Jesus says, well, you know the law. What does the law say? And this guy says, what Jesus says are the greatest commandments. There's another place where someone says, Teacher, what are the greatest commandments? And Jesus answers in the same way that this guy answers. He says, the two great commands are this, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And the second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. Again, quoting here from Leviticus 19. Love your neighbor as yourself. And you notice in this instance, they didn't leave off any of the verse. Okay, it doesn't say love your neighbor, hate your enemy. It says love your neighbor as yourself. So he understands. He quotes the verse fully. And let's see Jesus' response at verse 28 and verse 29.
And he said to him, You answer rightly. Do this, and you will live. And he wanted to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor?
And who is my neighbor? This is the question. How are we supposed to obey this unless we understand who is my neighbor? And Jesus, in order to explain to him who his neighbor is now going to share a parable. So will somebody please read verses 30 through 32?
Then Jesus answered and said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a certain priest came down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed by on the other side.
Okay, so Jesus is telling this story. He says a man is traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. This is obviously a Jewish man. And along the way, he gets caught by some robbers, and the robbers beat him up, and they take his clothes, and they take all this stuff, and they leave him on the side of the road to die. And around that time, a priest starts walking down the road. And the guy's probably thinking, oh, thank goodness, here's my brother. Here's one of my own kinsmen. Here's one of my own countrymen. He's going to help me. This is my neighbor, after all. This is my neighbor come to help me. And the priest, who, of course, he couldn't soil himself. He couldn't touch a bloody man. He had to serve God, after all. He had to go to the temple, and he couldn't become unclean by helping this bloody man on the side of the road. He had to serve God. So instead of walking over there, he avoided him. He went to the other side of the road because he had to go serve God, you see. He didn't have time to stop and help this man who was beat up on the side of the road. Little time later, a Levite comes. Same kind of deal. Oh, here's my brother. Here's my kinsman. Here's one of my own people. He's going to help me. Levite, same deal. He didn't have time to stop and help the man who had been beaten. He didn't have time to help and stop for the man who had been hurt. After all, he had service in the temple he had to do. He couldn't become unclean. He had a job. He had to serve God. How could he be helping this guy? He doesn't have time. He's too busy serving God to actually help and do some good, you see. And this is how the story is going. Let's continue the story, reading verse 33 through 35.
But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense that you may have.
Okay, so the story continues. The priest didn't help, the Levite didn't help, but here comes this Samaritan. And I'm sure the guy's thinking, oh great, here comes this filthy dog. I'd rather him not even touch me. Just leave me here to die, okay? My own people aren't even going to, just go, please. The last thing I need is this Samaritan to come and bother me. But the Samaritan does come. And what is the deal with the Samaritans? What is the relationship between Jews and Samaritans? They don't like each other. They're not fans of each other, right? To the Jew, a Samaritan was like a half-breed. They were half Jewish, half Gentile. They had some perverted form of Judaism was their religion. They worshipped on a different mountain. The Jews hated the Samaritans. In fact, the tradition goes like this, that in the time of Jesus, a Jew who lived in Galilee in the north, in order to get down to Judea in the south, you would have to pass through Samaria in the middle, where all the Samaritans lived. And a religious Jew in that day would not just pass through Samaria, they would go around Samaria to get to Judea because the prejudice was so strong. They didn't even want to go through where these people lived. They would go the long way around simply to avoid having to interact with Samaritans. That's why it's so scandalous in John 4 when Jesus says we must go through Samaria. And then he speaks to the Samaritan woman at the well. Like, it doesn't get any lower than that, right? A Samaritan woman 5 times divorced, like the worst outcast in society, right? But Jesus says, I must go to Samaria in order to speak with that person. I need to go there to meet with this woman, this hated, lowly esteemed person. I've got to go to meet them. But the point here is that Jews hated Samaritans, and Samaritans returned the favor. This was a mutual feeling. As it often is when there is that kind of animus, the feeling is mutual. They just don't like each other. Yet we see a Samaritan man coming, and what does he do? He doesn't kick the Jew while he's down. No, instead he picks him up, he washes his wounds, he cleans him, he anoints him with oil, he cleans his wounds with wine, loads him up on his own donkey, takes him to the hotel, the hospital, whatever, pays for him to stay. And he says, listen, I'm coming back. Whatever he owes, when I come back, I'll square it up with you. He basically the verse that really stands out to me when we read this story is when it says this: he had compassion on him. The Samaritan had compassion on this beaten and bloody Jew. And moved with compassion, he performed works of mercy for his enemy. He exercised the virtue of mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. He began to exercise. He began to heal the sick. He began to anoint his wounds and to help him recover. He lifted him up, put him in a safe place to help him recover. And let's see the conclusion of this story. Let's read verse 36 and 37.
Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him.
So you see in that, there's one thing I want to point out is that, the animosity between Jews and Samaritans was so great, this scribe would not even say the word Samaritan. He wouldn't say it was the Samaritan who was his neighbor. It was the guy who helped him. Who was his neighbor? The one who had compassion. He hated them so much he wouldn't even say the word Samaritan. It was the guy who had compassion on him. And your translation may not say this. In the King James and the New King James and in versions like that, it says, go and do likewise.
It did. I thought that was a different version.
Okay, yes, go and do likewise. And the emphasis here really seems to be, again, let's hearken back to this idea that for many of these people in Jesus' time, the idea, who is my neighbor? It is the one who is benevolent to me. It is the one who has compassion on me. It is the one who shows mercy to me. That one is my neighbor. And Jesus asked the question, who was the neighbor to the man? Who was the one who was the neighbor? Who was the one who showed compassion? Who was the one who was benevolent? Who was the one who showed mercy to the man who was beaten and bloodied on the side of the road? And the answer was, the one who was his neighbor was the Samaritan. And Jesus says, so you should go and be more like the Samaritan. And to say that to a scribe would have just, again, it's like putting a cheese grater on your face. Like Jesus just really, every time he talks to these people, he is really putting it on them. But he's saying you should be more like the Samaritan. You should be, here's the idea. Don't be concerned with who is benevolent toward you. The question is not who is kind to you. The question is not how do people treat you. The question is, how are you treating other people?
That's right.
The question is, how is your benevolence being shown to other people? How are you performing works of mercy for other people? The question is not who's being a good neighbor to you. The question is, are you being a good neighbor to everybody else? For notice what Jesus says. Who was the neighbor to that man? The one who showed mercy. So go and be like that. Go and be like that guy. You want to worry about who is your neighbor? Don't worry about who your neighbor is. You just be a neighbor to everybody. Everybody is your neighbor, is the essence of the story. Even your enemies are your neighbor. Even those filthy dog Samaritans are your neighbor. Any questions, thoughts, or comments about that?
I think it's kind of, I'm not sure if you call it or not. Instead of using the word, he replaces the word neighbor for mercy or kindness, because the natural word would be, well, who was the kind one? Instead he said, who was the neighbor?
Yeah.
So they're interchangeable that way. So it destroys the link between, is a neighbor a person of distance or of genetics, or whatever. A neighbor is a person, anybody who does the kind and merciful and godly things. So everybody's your neighbor.
Right.
Everybody in the world.
Right. And even more so, we should be the ones behaving neighborly toward everybody. We are the neighbor. We are the neighbor. And are we behaving neighborly is the question. Are we behaving neighborly toward everybody, including our enemies, in the same way that the Good Samaritan behaved neighborly toward his enemy? Are we doing that as well? Very good observation. Anything else?
Anytime you see someone who's had a flat along the side of the road and someone just, some random person just stops and helps them change the tire, because that has happened to me before. That is I guess you could say, the Good Samaritan.
He's got to use discretion nowadays, though.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Definitely.
But yeah,
that's
that's
just a really good example, and that has happened to me, you know, as far as that's concerned, being helped by, you know, someone like that.
absolutely.
Always pray over, my discretion comes from the Holy Spirit. Same thing with the people that are asking for money. Sometimes I really believe that person really needs it, but I always, Lord, if you want me to do it, if you want me to give them some money, or if you want me to go get them some food or something, put it on my heart right now. If not, you know, I'll leave it in your hand.
Absolutely.
Tonight, we have to meet to everybody.
Absolutely. And I guess I'll kind of close with this. We're running short on time. We've made it through the Old Testament background. We've answered the question, who is my neighbor? You see, you have heard that it was said you should love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But what we have actually discovered is this concept of loving our neighbors extends to our enemies. It doesn't stop with our enemies. It actually extends to them. This is what was written by Moses. When Jesus talks about it, that's how he explains it. This idea of loving our neighbor extends to that. And behaving neighborly, even toward our enemies. We've heard a couple anecdotes. I'll share an anecdote myself. I've got a good friend of mine. Her name is Jeanette Williams. She is the wife of the late Carl Williams, and they were pastors in this area for a long time. She told me a story one time. And she believes that this was an encounter that she had with like a real life angel. This was an angelic encounter that she had. But this would have been back in like the 60s. And some of you were alive in the 60s, so you remember the climate. You remember what it was like. You remember how race relations were in the 60s in particular. And she tells a story of she was driving on this road and she got to the top of this hill. And at the top of the hill, the car shut down, or she had a flat tire. Something happened. She had to pull over to the side of the road. And you could look this way and you could see for miles because you're on the top of the hill. And you could look this way and you could see for miles because you're on top of the hill. And she was doing something. She was fussing with something under the hood. And she looks up, and all of a sudden, there was somebody there. And it was this great, big, tall, black as ivory man. This very tall, very dark black man, who was dressed in a really fancy suit and driving a really fancy pink Cadillac. And you got to remember now, we're talking about the 1960s. And this was a woman who would have been a young girl, basically, at the time, who was alone in the middle of nowhere. And here's this great big giant black man up on her, and she's terrified, right? And so, anyway, he just comes along and he does something. He starts to tinker under the hood, and her car gets to going. It starts right back up. And she's just so elated. She's so happy that this man had come, that he showed up, and that he helped her. And, she did something. I don't remember what she was doing. But when she came back out, she looked around and he was just gone. He was gone. His car was gone. You looked to the left, you didn't see anything coming. You looked to the right, you didn't see anybody going. Just out of the blue, this very large black man appeared to her and helped her on the side of the road and then disappeared. And this, she to this day believes it was an angel, but even if it wasn't an angel, what do we see? We see in this situation a Good Samaritan situation. In a time and in a context where racial animosity was extremely high, and in the South nonetheless, you see this black man stop to help this little white girl fix her car on the side of the road. And it's the kind of Good Samaritan act of love, work of mercy that breaks down those barriers of prejudice, that breaks down those ethnic divisions, that breaks down those rooted in historic things where people would say, you're my enemy and I'm your enemy and we don't like each other and we're not going to help each other. But in her life, that left a lasting impression on her, not only because it was angelic, but I believe that the experience itself probably did a lot of work in that young girl of destroying years and years of built-up prejudice that had existed and been passed on for generations. You understand what I'm saying? And so things like that, you never know when you meet your enemy on the hillside and you help him, what kind of lasting impact that has even down the road. Or just stopping to help somebody on the side of the road when you can, when it's a wise decision to make, what kind of impact that will have on that person's life going into the future, what kind of impact it can have on your life to be in a situation where you need the help of a Good Samaritan, how it can break down our own prejudices and destroy this whole concept of animosity and hatred and having enemies when we're put in a position where our enemy is the only one who is kind to us. Our enemy is the only one who helps us. Our enemies are the only one. That can bring us conviction, and it can help us to grow and be transformed as well. So, any final questions, thoughts, or comments before we wrap up this evening?
That was back before cell phones, so she didn't have a way to call for help.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So finally, what is your definition, or what do you say the Bible says a neighbor is, and who is it?
A neighbor is everybody. Everybody. Our neighbor, our family is our neighbor, our people in our church are our neighbor, people in our neighborhood are our neighbor.
We don't like.
Even the people we don't like.
Even Chinese.
The Chinese are our neighbor, you know? And we are commanded by Christ to love even our enemies. And that's what we're going to get into next week. Next week we've heard the Old Testament background. We've heard Jesus say, "You have heard that it was said." Next week we'll get into what Jesus has to say, his explanation, "But I say unto you." And so next week we'll get into that. We'll talk more about these textual variants that we find, and we'll just really get into what Jesus says and how we can begin to apply this in our life. It might take a couple more weeks to get through it, but this was great discussion tonight. I really appreciate that. Anything else this evening?